everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Cailin Birch, our Global Economist, and Mark Keller, an analyst in our Latin America team based in London. Today, we're going to discuss the outlook for the US presidential election in November and US-Mexico relations following the visit of the Mexican president to the US. Before we start, one word about our latest global economic forecasts. We now believe that global output is going to contract by around 5% this year. The US is going to post a 5.3% recession as per our latest forecasts, and China is going to be one of the only G20 countries recording growth at 1.4%. And actually this matters a lot because this is going to shift our outlook for the US presidential election. So now I'm going to turn to you, Cailin, to discuss how the coronavirus-induced recession in the US is relevant for the presidential election. So maybe, Cailin, tell us, what impact has the pandemic had on the presidential election outlook?
It's had a huge impact, to be fair, and we do now forecast a firm Biden victory, which will usher in some major changes. Now, just to give a little background, things had already looked very difficult for President Trump to attain re-election. He had a series of conditions that lined up perfectly in 2016 that allowed him to win a fairly narrow victory in a handful of swing states that led to, again, a narrow victory in the Electoral College. He would have required a lot, again, of those conditions to line up just right. And it's already been looking for the last few months, even prior to the outbreak of coronavirus, that they might not line up in his favor. But this has really been the final straw. And if we look back at previous presidential elections, economic conditions immediately surrounding, within the few months around the presidential election, are a key determinant of how Americans tend to vote. And we think Q3 for the United States is going to be extremely difficult. Already in the first half of the year, we've seen more than 40 million Americans apply for enhanced unemployment benefits as part of the extraordinary measures put in place to try to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus shutdowns. And it looks like many of those enhanced benefits are not going to be extended past their deadline in July. And that means, as a result, that millions of Americans will be in a more precarious financial situation in the third quarter surrounding the time of the election than they are now. And all that bodes very poorly for Trump.
But actually, the current recession stems from a global pandemic. So is there any way that things could play out differently for Trump?
We're definitely in a unique position this year. I mean, Donald Trump is a very unique politician, and this is a very unique circumstance that we find ourselves in economically and politically. And without a doubt, President Trump is definitely trying to spin the blame for this crisis abroad on China. He's also tried to spin it domestically on Democrats. And even recently, we've seen in the last few days, members of his own administration, including those who are responsible for leading the public health response, have come under criticism from the president. So it's entirely possible that this situation could affect President Trump differently than other recession-era presidents have been affected by economic conditions surrounding, again, their time that they're seeking re-election. But at the same time, I think that as we get closer to the election, the impact of the coronavirus and the severe recession the US is going to be going through, 5.3% contraction, as you said before, is going to start to wear off, and we'll see more typical election time politics. We've seen already a lot of examples from other countries as to what could be necessary to control or at least slow down the rise in case numbers, which haven't necessarily been applied consistently across the United States. And I think as we start to see the US fall behind other countries in terms of their response to an ability to control the coronavirus outbreak, we might actually see the administration suffering again from that same accountability, looking at the current economic conditions and pinning it to policies rather than freak accidents or bad luck or what have you. And I think that does again bode quite badly for the sitting administration. We've seen recent polling that shown a majority of Americans disapprove of the administration's response to the crisis, but more importantly than that, we've seen a majority of independent voters, those swing voters who'd be critical to victory for either candidate, who as a majority disapprove of the administration's handling of the crisis. So that again is really the second straw that is just one step too far.
So do you think that a win for Biden is now unavoidable, or could something still tip the scales?
At this point, I'd say it's very unlikely that Trump will be able to engineer a victory. It would take sort of a surprise element, a shock to our forecast. He's really lost the key consistencies that, again, helped him to tread that very narrow path to victory in 2016. That include a lot of working class voters in so-called Rust Belt states, so struggling post-industrial states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, that again tipped the scales for him in the Electoral College in 2016. We've seen those elements of the electorate, but also suburban voters, move away from Trump and the administration in recent polling. So those core elements that were critical to him winning last time have moved, it seems, decisively away from the administration. And the only thing I think that could change the outlook, again, would be one of these shock events. So a surprise reversal in the Trump administration's policies, particularly surrounding social events and the significant wave in social unrest we've seen demanding action on racial inequality and policing standards in the United States. The administration come out very firmly in opposition to those protests. A swing in policy could actually influence events, but again, we don't think that's very likely. The second, and perhaps even more important thing, would be the pace of vaccine development. If we were to see a vaccine on the market between now and November, that could really change the economic dynamic and therefore Trump's re-election chances. But again, all evidence suggests that Trump will not have one of those shock factors working in his factor. He'll continue to campaign on the themes that are not currently working in his favor, and we don't expect that to get him back into office.
Thanks so much, Cailin. So I'm going to turn to Mark now to discuss AMLO's recent visit to the US and the implementation of the USMCA and obviously what it means for Mexico. So Mark, as an opening question, maybe can you tell us a bit more, please, about why this visit happened and why it's so significant?
Sure. So nominally, this visit was to, as you mentioned, to inaugurate the USMCA. But the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, said, understandably, that maybe now is not the best time for him to make an international visit. So what we had instead was this bilateral meeting between Trump and AMLO. This is AMLO's first trip abroad since taking office. He's traveled quite a bit around Mexico, to enough trips to travel around the world many times. But he's skipped really important global meetings in the past, like the G20, the UN General Assembly. So it was interesting that for the first trip abroad, he chose to go visit Trump, in light of so many issues between Trump and Mexico over the years. And really what this reflects is that AMLO as a president is not terribly interested in foreign policy. He's said over and over again that the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. He wants to focus domestically. So this was a big deal, and that this is when he chose to leave the country.
But essentially, given all of Trump's rhetoric regarding Mexico, the heated rhetoric, maybe we would have expected these two not to really get along. But when we take a look at it, well, the visit was really warm. So why is that? What happened here?
Right. So I think, these are two men that have a lot in common in some ways. They are both populists, AMLO nominally to the left, Trump to the right. And AMLO had been quite fierce in his rhetoric towards Trump as well in the campaign trail in 2018. He published a book called Oye Trump, essentially Listen Up Trump, about how he was going to be harsh and not just bow down to the president. But really, we've seen a complete 180 since AMLO took office. He's been very accommodative to the US administration. He hasn't responded aggressively to any of Trump's tweets or threats. When the US threatened tariffs last year, unless Mexico did more to combat Central American migration, Mexico did more to combat Central American migration. And they don't want problems. And the reason that is exactly what I said before, that AMLO is not interested in foreign policy. He doesn't want to be distracted by poor relations with the US. He doesn't want to get drawn into some battle with Trump. And it also just reflects the realities of Mexico. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the US. The country is the source of nearly all of its remittances. And like other global leaders, AMLO has figured out what leaders like Putin or Erdogan have figured out, which is if you want Trump to be on your side and leave you alone, go butter him up. So AMLO went to DC, had a very nice chat with Trump, told him great things about himself. And I think from Trump's side, obviously he appreciates this praise, but also AMLO is a very powerful leader. He was elected with the largest margin in Mexico's recent democratic history. He commands majorities. His approval ratings are above 60%, and Trump likes other powerful leaders. So this is, Also a good insurance policy for AMLO. AMLO is going to be in office until 2024. If Trump gets reelected, which as we just discussed is not our baseline forecast, but certainly a possibility, then AMLO has gone and made good with Trump. And if Biden wins, it didn't hurt AMLO in any way to go to DC and do this.
So the meeting was to inaugurate the USMCA, so free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Can you talk to us a bit more about this agreement and how it differs from NAFTA, its predecessor?
Sure. So it's broadly the same as NAFTA, same spirit of commitment to free trade of goods, except now it's been updated. It includes things for the 21st century like e-commerce, and it introduces some new standards such as the environment and labor. Also, it will be reviewed every 6 years, and the agreement just lasts 16 years, which was one of the Trump administration's demands, but of course it can be renewed. So all of this is good news for North American business in that it gives some trade certainty where really this had been very much up in the air. The biggest changes I think are in the automotive sector, where we have new rules of origin for content. It's for North American content, it is now up to 75% from 62.5% previously. And also significantly, it mandates that 40% of content be made by workers that are paid at least $16 US an hour, which is well above the Mexican minimum wage of around $5.50 a day. So it should see either Mexican workers getting more higher pay or perhaps more manufacturing in the US and Canada. The agreement does have a weaker dispute settlement than NAFTA did. It allows the penalizing of specific companies or plants if they're found to violate labor or other elements of the agreement, which is significant. And it's interesting that this has been inaugurated now, just amid the COVID pandemic, because it'll probably mean a bit of a bumpier introduction than we might have otherwise anticipated. So we expect, as businesses which are struggling, elements of the US-Mexico supply chain have reopened, but it's going to take some time for business that is already adjusting to this very difficult new reality to perhaps also adjust to some of the new mechanisms in this trade agreement. So perhaps from 2021, we'll start seeing more effects of it, but for the near term, a bit bumpy.
Thanks so much, Mark. We're coming to the end of our video. So thanks, Cailin, and thanks, Mark, for joining us. You can always find our latest analysis on www.eau.com, our website. You can find our recent white papers on the US presidential election, on the impact of the pandemic on sovereign debt crisis, or the likelihood of sovereign debt crisis, or our recent white paper about when countries will recover back to pre-coronavirus GDP levels. You can also find our analysis on Twitter at @DEAU or on our personal Twitters and our handles, which are nicely on the screen. Thank you very much for joining us this month, and I look forward to recording our next Global Outlook video next month. Thank you very much. Goodbye.